A very warm welcome to all the participants who have joined this session. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So, very good morning to everyone. My name is Nitigya Mathur from Department of English, JCRC University, Jaipur, and the title of my presentation is Exploration of Memory and Trauma in Conflict Zones, with focus on the Kashmiri Pandit Exodus and Rahul Pandita's novel Our Moon Has Blood Clots. Before we continue with the author and we explore and analyze the text a little bit, I would like to give you an introduction on on trauma and memory. Historical trauma, communal memory, which is associated with a specific community, and disputed political and socio-cultural narratives have always been central to a number of conflict zones all over the world. You could include Kashmir, you could include Palestine and Israel, and certain areas of Afghanistan. The psychological landscape of these areas is characterized by ethnic cleansing, the uprooting of communities, the destruction of cultural and social identities, and the generational trauma that persists over a prolonged period. The aim of this particular research was to analyze the characters and the narrative structure of the novel in question in context of the trauma that was a result of the of that was a result of decades of conflict in that particular region. The research aims to engage with the dynamics of memory and trauma in context of conflict zones, with focus on the Kashmir conflict in the Indian subcontinent and the forced migration of the minority Kashmiri Hindu or Pandit community during the heightened militancy in the region in the late 1980s to the early mid 90s. So the focus of this particular presentation and why research in general is on the writings of Rahul Pandita. He is a journalist and author based in New Delhi. His writings can be categorized into the mold of literary journalism or creative nonfiction. We'll engage and explore a little bit in detail. So his
Uh,
three important.
Sorry to interrupt you, sir, but your PPT is not shared.
Sorry, ma'am, I'll just check it. Okay, I hope it's visible now.
Yes, sir, it is visible.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we were talking about Rahul Pandita. He's a journalist and author based in New Delhi, and broadly speaking, the literary works that he has written can be categorized. They could be viewed as a hybrid form of literature which tries to fuse literature and journalism as two distinct uh, forms. So the three prominent writings of his are Hello Bastar, The Untold Story of India's Maoist Movement, which was published in 2011. It is an exploration of the Naxalite and Maoist movement in central India in the region of Chhattisgarh. The second novel that we'll focus on is Our Moon Has Blood Clots, published in 2013, a gripping portrayal of the historical and contemporary socio-cultural and political and civilizational dynamics of Kashmir from the medieval era to the violent militancy of the 1980s. And his latest book, The Lover Boy of Bahawalpur, published in 2021, it again fuses the elements of investigative uh, work of nonfiction and with literary journalism, and it follows the aftermath of the 2019 Pulwama attacks and critically engages with the history of militancy in Kashmir in the current century. So while Our Moon Has Blood Clots focuses specifically on the history of the community, the Kashmiri Pandit community, and the exodus that happened due to the militancy due to in the 1980s and the 1990s, the Lover Boy of Bahawalpur. If you look at the title and if you look at the narrative structure, it follows the structure of a typical investigative thriller, but at the same time, it contains elements of robust journalism, that is as it tries to include as much of first-hand information from various sources from law enforcement agencies and military personnel. So before engaging with the text, it is important to it is important to understand the genre a little bit. Literary journalism or creative nonfiction. For some scholars and individuals, these two terms might work as a bit of an oxymoron or a bit of a paradox, because a work of literature, how could that be associated with journalism? Because traditionally speaking, journalism is something which is associated with factual information, objectivity, and something which focuses and relies more on giving information instead of putting forth a more subjective, a more creative perspective of the author. So Keval J. Kumar, in his book Mass Communication in India, he argues that the element of information is quite central to and quite critical to understanding mass media or journalism. He further defines a journalist as anyone who contributes in some way to the gathering, selection, and processing of news and current affairs. In this process, a journalist must adhere to certain guidelines such as brevity, objectivity, accuracy, and working and operating with primary sources. Literary journalism and creative nonfiction generally fuse the above mentioned guidelines of journalism with slight deviations from certain literary practices. To give you an example from the two texts of Rahul Pandita that are actually set in Kashmir, Our Moon Has Blood Clots tries to include as much first-hand information as possible. There are a lot of testimonies from individuals from Kashmiri Pandits and also other members of the community and uh, some other individuals who were associated with the administration, and it tries to bring across their perspective of that time and how do they view and are able to analyze that particular period in history retrospectively, even more recently. So on that account, it could be viewed as a it's a very astute work of journalism. But upon closer examination, it is it's very clearly determined that he does try to bring about his own perspective, his own understanding of the conflict and at large, not only from a contemporary but from a more historical perspective. So the author has done a quite an important job in engaging with the civilizational memory of the landscape and not only focusing on the contemporary realpolitik and geopolitics. Political neutrality, objectivity, and brevity make way for a more descriptive form of reporting on a certain event. It shies away from the to the point approach that is imperative for a formal newspaper report, and it is argued that an individual journalist cannot be objective and unbiased in their story. So I feel that this last line is quite important to understand the need to approach literary works like Our Moon Has Blood Clots, because on one hand there is a traditional assumption that a journalist or a reporter and in general, if you are associated with the field of journalism, you have to operate from a neutral position, and you have to be as objective as possible and as unbiased and possible while engaging with a particular story. And the paradox and in this particular text, you would observe that the author is trying to fuse the two elements together of objectivity and subjectivity, and the personal and the political. The ideology, political inclinations could come into play in specific cases, and this becomes even more pertinent when it comes to reporting in conflict zones. In the age of social media, when major media networks and even print journalism are facing a crisis of credibility because of political polarization in recent years, journalists have been forced to acknowledge the question of objectivity and ideology. Now let's focus on the primary text that we'll take a look at for this particular presentation. Our Moon Has Blood Clots, a detailed overview. Published by Rahul Pandita, written by Rahul Pandita. The novel, published in 2013, is a first-person autobiographical account of the protagonist. The non-linear narrative of the text juxtaposes the personal with the political and the historical with the contemporary. I had mentioned that Rahul Pandita was born in the Kashmir Valley in 1976, and he was roughly around 14 years old when when the militancy reached its peak and the exodus happened in January 1990. So he had spent the first 14 years of his life in Srinagar, and the first part of the novel, actually, if you focus on that, it it is almost exclusively an account of the Kashmiri culture life, the history, the tradition, and his own experiences in that particular political climate. So it does try to create a balance between his personal ideology, his personal reception, his personal experiences as a fairly young boy in growing up in Kashmir from the minority community, and he tries to fuse that retrospectively with all the parallel political and uh, geopolitical factors that were actually framing his own individual personal experiences. And it is important to understand that a lot of the incidents mentioned in the text, that from an almost postmodern perspective, they do try to rely a lot on memory, and to a large extent also on his reading of that entire period of time as a journalist who's trying to objectively analyze what was really going on at that time. And in the first section of the novel, there are several examples when he tries to specifies many specific uh, events that took place in Kashmir. So, for example, in 1983, when India and West Indies played a cricket match, which was the first and last international cricket match that was played in Srinagar, and the reaction of the crowd that had come to watch that game, which was quite hostile towards towards the Indian cricketers. So that again, that event is described as a very innocuous and a very innocent part of his childhood memory, but owing to the larger political framework, it ties into the geopolitical aspects, which involved the Afghan jihad, which was happening in context of Soviet Russia, and also how Pakistan by that time had also started, supporting a lot of militants in that particular region. The narratorial voice offers a critical reflection upon the historiography of Kashmir. To quote from the novel, Kashmir is so beautiful, my grandfather used to say. Even the gods are jealous of it. Pandita traces the history of Kashmir, highlighting its multicultural and syncretic past shaped by Hindu and Buddhist influences before the arrival of Islam. The author indicates the tradition of scholarly pursuits among the Pandits of Kashmir and their contributions towards philosophy, theology, and even history, and history writing was not something which was considered a very strong point of Indian literary tradition, but he argues in this text that they were the Kashmiri Pandits who actually started uh, focusing on the written word when it comes to the history. Thereafter, Pandita attempts to create a historical continuity by underlining the excesses of the various Islamic dynasties during the medieval era, from the Shahamiri dynasty in the 14th century to the Afghan rule of the 18th century, which resulted in dramatic demographic change in the region due to conversions and many small and large scale religious pogroms, as is indicated in detail by a passage from the novel. Again, to quote page number 19 of the novel, the Afghan rulers would surround the Pandits with naked swords and ask them to convert. Those who did not comply would be put to death immediately. For the rest, a calf would be slaughtered, and they would be fed its meat, and their sacred thread would be snapped. The trouble at home forced many Pandits to migrate. Many took shelter in Delhi, Lucknow, Lahore, and Allahabad, among other places. So this particular section, these passages from the novel, uh, quite with great, you could say, objectivity, and but also with a sense of you could say regret, and with a sense of lament, they highlight a sense of loss, a loss of identity, and it's not something which happened only in 1990, but it is described as an ongoing, perpetual, continual process which had been actually going on since the medieval era. So he tries to contextualize the conflict of Kashmir because uh, in political science or in history, or and in other various sociological and in other disciplines, when we talk about the Kashmir conflict, there is a tendency to start from with 1947, that the entire crisis and the entire the entire conflict and crisis and chaos actually started with the 1947 partition of India, and with the controversy around the instrument of accession. But it is important, it is really, really critical to understand the historical precedents to this conflict, and to in order to highlight that, he depicts the entire chronological history of Kashmir, from the last, let's say 2000 years or so, with a sense of loss, with a sense of lament. So it's the novel could also be analyzed as a form of an elegy to this idea of Kashmir that was to some extent lost, and it is still in the process of losing itself. So after describing in great detail the political instability with various emperors, various dynasties, and various empires that were able to control Kashmir for all those centuries, there was the Shahmiri dynasty. Then there was the Chak rulers, who actually followed the Shia sect of Islam. Then came the more violent and the more barbaric, the Afghan rule in the 18th century, when Kashmir was actually controlled by Ahmad Shah Abdali. And then it followed successively by the Sikh Empire, the Dogra rule, and eventually it culminated in 1947 during the partition of India. So post 1947 Kashmir. However, it is events from 1947 that play a significant role in framing the political consciousness and a sense of communal identity for the narrator. During the confusion and chaos surrounding the partition of India, Pakistan sent tribal invaders in October 1947 from northwest frontier province, which is also known as Pakhtunistan, aided by Pakistani army regulars to occupy Kashmir. They were hoping to secure the large-scale support of local Muslims from Kashmir, and it also worked in some cases. However, the National Conference workers played a major role in resisting the invasion. Eventually, the Maharaja of Kashmir signed the instrument of accession, and Kashmir officially became a part of India. The Indian army arrived in Srinagar, and the tribal forces were resisted and pushed back. So I hope this gives you a clear idea about the backdrop to this conflict. Of course, there are a lot of specific political nuances, and there are a lot of political and religious characters who are involved in this particular case. But I've tried to give you an overall view of the civilizational history of Kashmir, the the more, you could say, conflict prone and the more violent medieval era, and then how it resulted in a very with a great state of confusion, it ushered into the post 97 post independent India. The theoretical framework that I've employed in analyzing this particular literary text is based on memory and trauma in conflict zones. Memory and trauma provides Memory and trauma studies provide a crucial framework for understanding the impact of conflict on displaced communities. Trauma theory, as articulated by scholars such as Kathy Caruth, 1996, posits that traumatic events are often re-experienced in fragmented and repetitive ways, disrupting the linearity of memory. In order to analyze this, in order to expand a little bit on that, a very important aspect of this writing is its non-linearity, and it's and if you analyze, and if you start actually exploring the narrative, it is very difficult sometimes to actually keep track of various events and various characters, because there are frequent shifts in in timeline, and there are really frequent time jumps that take place in the novel. It's almost as if the author is trying to take and the author is trying to assemble different aspects of his memory, his contemporary interactions with different people who had something or the other to do with that era, and he's trying to fuse that with his own personal experiences to create a larger narrative of the Kashmiri Pandit history. And it is quite impossible to to be more linear and to create a straightforward narrative in that regard. Pierre Nora in 1989 introduces the concepts of lieux de mémoire or sites of memory, wherein displaced communities construct narratives that preserve a sense of identity in exile. These theoretical perspectives help analyze how Kashmiri Pandits have preserved their cultural memory post exodus and how trauma manifests in literary works such as Our Moon Has Blood Clots. So we'll take a look at the third point, Pera Nora's sort of uh, concept of sites of memory, and how displaced communities they try to create certain historical and cultural narratives when to adhere to a sense of exile for themselves. I think this could also be correlated or connected to the partition of India, because there are quite a few parallels between the two in this particular regard. And I've already mentioned that Rahul Pandita, the author himself, he tries to create a sense of uh, he tries to create a sense of identity. He tries to create a sense of a self for himself and for his community at large, as they operate in exile. So the entire historiography of the region of Kashmir Valley, or and of Kashmir at large, it doesn't it plays a very important role in allowing them to a sense of identity, while operating as a displaced community. Personal and political memory. In political science and in various sociological frameworks, we often come across this term that is personal political, or is it better to separate the personal and the political? I think in that regard, this novel is a very good example of how it is really difficult in many contexts to separate the personal from the political. It is a profoundly political and intimate narrative that details the community's horrific migration under extreme duress and socio-political intimidation. Pandita weaves a narrative around the loss, grief, and identity crisis as a result of the displacement of the community. He fuses historical and political narratives with personal memories of that era, that is, the Kashmir of the 1980s, and it works as a form of individual and a collective testimony. He frequently reminisces about his childhood in Kashmir, describing the idyllic landscapes, familiar bonds, and the cultural traditions that was abruptly severed. So I think it is important to take a look at certain examples from the text in order to understand the specific point about weaving personal memories with the larger political context. So I've already mentioned that how uh, uh, Rahul Pandita very evocatively describes that particular cricket match between India and the West Indies that was played in 1983, and it was almost like watching Pakistan play in Lahore, because that's how hostile the crowd was towards the Indian cricketers who were actually there. And if you look at some other examples from the text, he also mentions the 1986 cricket match between India and Pakistan that was played in Sharjah, where Javed Miandar hit a last ball six to win that match for Pakistan. And even in that particular game, he could see the author, the narrator, who was basically a 12-year-old child. He could see the hostile and the celebratory nature of people in that particular region, and he simply couldn't fail to connect or to make sense of what was really happening at that time. And and I think Rahul Pandita has done a very efficient job in actually portraying the slow and gradual radicalization of the local majority community in that particular region, because actually there are many sections in this novel when he also describes that how the society in Kashmir before the 1980s was by and large very syncretic. There was a lot of there were of course very cultural similarities and commonalities between the two communities, and they very much existed in relative peace. Of course, there were aberrations. There could be some violence, here and there, but by and large, in those few decades, despite some aberrations, it remained a syncretic uh, place with with cultural commonalities. But that descent had already started to happen. But that descent into madness had already started to happen in the 1980s, from mainly from early 1980s, even when Indira Gandhi, was the prime minister. The author sort of shuffles around in his memory to address some specific individuals from his childhood. For example, there is the example of Rahman, who used to bring milk to their place. So his example is cited as to how slowly and gradually he was becoming more and more aggressive and more hostile towards the idea of India. And he's also he's also uh, quite you could say celebratory whenever Pakistan wins a particular cricket match, and he's quite dismissive and condescending towards Indian cricketers and India at large. So this is one example of how cordial personal relationships had, by and large, started to be affected by the larger political context, because the propaganda of Pakistan was quite effective, and religious radicalization was operating in a dramatic way in that particular region. There's another character of Latif, who's a very good friend of the narrator's, cousin, and and it is hinted in the novel that even he turned towards, he also became a militant eventually, and was, and died later on. Let's continue. Trauma and displacement. Again, to quote from the novel, I had also come to Delhi in search of a better life, to regain some of what my family had lost during the exodus. But there was a difference between the other migrants and me. On festivals and on family functions, or when they were dying, they knew they could go back to where they had come from. Michel Balev's Trends in Literary Trauma Theory posits that trauma is a person's emotional response to an overwhelming event that disrupts the previous idea of an individual's sense of self. The term trauma novel is defined by Michel as a work of fiction that conveys profound loss or intense fear on individual or collective levels. So we have talked to some extent about how memory, how personal and political dynamics played a very important role in the 1980s. But it is also important to understand that the sense of displacement and the sense of loss that the community faced even after the exodus happened, because it could be argued that the worst thing to happen was had already happened in January 1990, when the exodus formally and officially actually started from the valley. Of course, people, assassinations, murders, and violence had already been happening for quite a few years. But the actual exodus, which as we know today, started in January 1990. But it is also really important to understand that the trauma and a sense of loss for the community didn't really end there. It actually continued for a long time. So a lot of members of the community, they from Srinagar and from various nearby regions, they actually had moved to Jammu, which was the nearest important city in that particular area. And the narrator himself recounts his experiences as a very young child, when they had moved to Jammu, and they had to leave their really lavish and a house with 22 rooms, and they were forced to live in a rented sort of room, which just had one or two rooms actually. So that dramatic decline in in standard of living, that loss of dignity that comes from leaving your own homeland, it is quite beautifully depicted by the narrator. And I think in that regard, it is important to understand the character of narrator's mother, to understand that sense of loss, that loss of dignity, because even after leaving Srinagar, she makes it a point to tell everyone whom she meets, that when we used to live in Srinagar, we used to have a home with 22 rooms, something which of course doesn't exist anymore. Because now, when they live in Jammu, when they go to any other place, they are actually viewed as refugees, as migrants, who are basically surviving on other people's, on the generosity of their host. And those specific events, those first hand events, from how they were actually not uh, looked at from a very sympathetic perspective by many people. And, it's a very harrowing sort of account of how that trauma and that sense of and that loss of dignity continued for long even after the exodus. To understand how trauma works in conflict zones, because it is generally viewed as an emotional response to an overwhelming event. And in this particular case, that overwhelming event was the exodus. And the individual's sense of self was majorly, you could say, disrupted and delineated in that particular context. In context of Michel Balev theorizations of trauma, Pandita's novel is an emotional and intellectual response to the harrowing trauma of the Exodus. Upon closer examination, it is evident that the narrative employs the Pandit community's historiography as a tool to counter the sense of alienation, displacement, and a loss of identity as a migrant community in places like Jammu and Delhi. And I've already mentioned that the Jammu episodes of the narrative resist the allegations of a weak, defeated community. And then there are passages that tend to glorify the pre Islamic past of Kashmir and highlight the excesses of successive centuries that serve the purpose. Thereafter, the trauma of the community at large is manifested as a form of cultural resistance throughout their history. While talking about trauma theory, we came across this specific term that how in when a community or when an individual is displaced, their sense of self is quite majorly raptured. So I think it is important to connect that to partition studies, because in partition studies there are short stories such as Sadat Hasan Manto's Toba Takesing that reveal that an event like the partition of India dismantled the sense of self and the identity of millions of individuals who were displaced or were forced to adopt an alien national or cultural identity. Similarly, Rahul Pandita's Kashmiri Hindu or Pandit characters from this childhood and later betray a form of anger and resentment towards several institutions. For them, the events of 1990 were a rebellion against the Indian state. For me, these same events had led to exile and permanent homelessness. The home with 22 rooms serves as a metaphor for the economic and intellectual wealth of the Pandit community and is reiterated by the narrator's mother during their exile. There is also a very strong, there's a very specific part in the novel right after the Exodus when the narrator's father, who had been delaying to leave Kashmir for a long time because they always thought that things would get better, things would eventually improve, and that this current state of chaos and madness is not really permanent. So there comes a point when they finally make that decision to leave Kashmir and to, of course, there is no other option but to leave your ancestral home. Something in which they had invested a lot of monetary and emotional resources. So in that particular scene, there's a dialogue, there's a line by which is said by the narrator's father, and he says when he almost exhorts the evil spirits and all the evil to stay away from this particular home, as this home is watched over by the guardian deity. The first section of the novel is a nostalgic recollection of the narrator's childhood memories, revolving around the family background, mundane details about the household, and a very comprehensive depiction of the celebration of Shivaratri, the most important festival for Kashmiri Hindus, one of the most important festivals, arguably, owing to their Shaivite identity. Literary theorist Kathy Caruth, in Unclaimed Experience, argues that it is difficult to represent trauma in literary studies. The way it was precisely not known in the first place returns to haunt the survivor later on. And Kathy's abreactive model of trauma allows us to interpret the narrative as a form of cathartic therapy for the author as he revisits several unpleasant memories, incidents, and some subtle and some brazen acts of political otherization that he experiences in when he is actually a child. The narrator describes a nightmare he had in 1987, where he saw that their kitchen gardens were infested with sword wielding marauders who wore sandals made of dry straw. Now, it was a result of his grandfather's portrayal of the aforementioned tribal invasion of the Kashmir Valley in October 1947, and the straw sandal wearing men referred to the mysterious but violent and barbaric Lashkars from NWFP. And in his dream, they attacked and killed his maternal cousin, Ravi. Kareth argues that trauma can potentially infect another pure or integrated subject through acts of narration or based upon a shared ancestry or ethnic origin. So, of course, the narrator's grandmother was a very young person in 1947 when the memory of the Lashkar invasion in October 1947 are quite vivid in their memory, and it has almost become a very significant part of the collective memory of of these areas, not only in Srinagar but also in areas such as Baramulla and Muzaffarabad and so on and so forth. And and the fact that the grandfather has had actually passed on that narrative to the narrator, it actually manifested that the collective trauma uh, was manifested in the form of this nightmare that they had, and the imagery of those barbaric sword wielding marauders, and who was actually wearing sandals from dry straw. So that actually sort of allows us to understand that how trauma is something which can be transferred in this particular way, and it can be transferred not only on the basis of narration, but it can also sometimes happen through ancestry or through common ethnic origins. January 19, 1990. The part 2 of the text is an incredible, harrowing, and haunting depiction of the events of January 19, 1990. The sections preceding to this part of the novel highlight the number of local, national, and international or geopolitical factors that had fueled the militancy in Kashmir. There's a gradual build-up which is represented through a number of characters in the text who turn towards religious radicalization. The frequent used and the much abused term in contemporary Indian political discourse, Azadi, drums up the collective trauma of the Pandit community in exile, even in the middle of certain innocuous jokes about regional stereotypes. So the author actually, when he grows up, when he had grown up and he had moved to New Delhi as a student, he's often mocked by many of his peers, non-Kashmiri peers, because of their peculiar, because of the, I mean, I wouldn't use the word peculiar, but because of the slightly different accent that they had. So, for example, Bharat becomes Bharat and Ghar becomes Ghar. So there were, of course, there was general banter which revolved around regional stereotypes, but many of those individuals also used the term azadi, hum leke rahenge azadi. Those terms are also used to create, to further reinforce and to maybe generate humor at the expense of regional stereotypes. But this specific example actually drums up, the trauma of not only of the individual but of the community at large. In fact, in one of his interviews a few years ago, Rahul Pandita, the author, he actually specifies that even today in progressive Indian discourse, the term azadi, the semiotics of the term azadi have become associated with resistance against the state, or maybe resistance or revolt against any institution of power. But for the community at large, the significations of the term azadi would always be rooted in violence, bigotry, and theocracy. So in this section, we are introduced to the ideological origins of the term and its signification of violence, bigotry, and theocracy. The chilling winters of 1989 to 1990 witnessed the peak of Kashmir's militancy and terrorism. Kashmir was like a deer in a wolf's neck. Pandita, 62. The chronological delineation of events interpreted and authored retrospectively by the author, by the author, fuse the elements of journalism and fictional narrative, a narrative strategy that Pandita also employs in The Lover Boy of Bahawalpur. Reconstructing the traumatic experiences of the self, the community, under the framework of a journalistic friction that must prioritize objective facts. In the format of a news story or a documentary, the author hands over the narratorial voice to several individuals who had experienced that violence firsthand. For example, Satish Tikku was a young Kashmiri Pandit boy in Srinagar who was killed by the one of the militants. The next section is memory and politics. The contestation over historical narratives in conflict zone extends to media, to literature and media representation. In the case of the Kashmiri Pandit exodus, mainstream discourse has often sidelined the Pandit perspective, prioritizing broader geopolitical debates over Kashmir. The memoir serves as a corrective to this marginalization, bringing the personal sufferings of the community to the forefront. So, this part could be a bit debatable, but the fact remains that the novel was published in 2013, and before that, there did remain a huge gap in context of literature, which specifically engaged with the perspective of the Pandit community. This is not to say that the event was almost exclusively ignored in the 1989 to 90. Of course, it did not gather the national attention that it maybe required, but in literary and cultural context, it was by and large ignored. However, the politicization of memory remains a challenge. Critics argue that focusing exclusively on the Pandit exodus without acknowledging the suffering and trauma of Kashmiri Muslims during the insurgency risks reinforcing communal divisions. This raises ethical questions about representation. How can literature memorialize trauma without exacerbating polarization? Contemporary popular film narratives such as Shikara and the Kashmir Files have attracted controversies and discussions around the political biases of representing a conflict. So, apart from the novel by Rahul Pandita, there have been few other there have been one more book which focuses specifically on first person accounts of many individuals who who suffered because of the exodus. But when we talk about popular culture or popular Hindi cinema, there are only two examples, two mainstream examples recently, which have tried to engage with the subject, and both are quite completely different. Shikara, for that matter, which released in 2020, the screenplay was also written by the author Rahul Pandita, and the novel is also takes some sort of uh, inspiration from the novel. However, it is not really, it is not a direct adaptation of the text, but it does, sort of borrow some plot points. But it was broadly marketed and presented as a love story in in a conflict zone. The Kashmir Files, on the other hand, is a more unapologetic. It's a more, you could say, raw and almost it also depicts the events of that period in the form of almost in the form of a documentary, in the sense that it captures all those specific events that have that were quite prominent at that time, and it tries to put them forward in a more fictionalized form. Comparative analysis: memory and trauma in global conflict zones. The Kashmiri Pandit exodus shares similarities with other instances of forced displacement, such as the Jewish Holocaust, the Palestinian Nakba, and the Armenian genocide. In each case, the displaced communities have relied on collective memory and cultural preservation as means of resilience. Studies on Holocaust survivors emphasize the lasting psychological scars and intergenerational trauma, a phenomena also observed among Kashmiri Pandit families. Like the Pandits, Palestinian refugees have cultivated a strong memory culture, passing down stories of their lost homeland through oral histories and literature. This comparison highlights how memory serves as a resistance strategy against erasure and assimilation. So, finally, to conclude the session, the finality of Exodus, leave from here, O misfortune. This house is guarded by the deity of the house. The complexities of historical representation and identity formation are revealed by investigating memory and trauma in war areas. Our Moon Has Blood Clots tells the story of the Kashmiri Pandit exodus, and it is a prime example of how literature may be used to bear witness, preserve cultural memory, and deal with trauma. We can better comprehend how communities deal with loss, resiliency, and contested histories by placing this case study within worldwide displacement narratives. And in order to ensure that all aspects of historical trauma are recognized and handled, it is still imperative to connect with varied voices as conflicts continue. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, sir. The floor is now open for questions. If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself or you can type your question in the chat box.